Hello everyone. So, today we will be discussing the last portion of this ecological footprint. So, it is obviously a continuation from our lecture 1 ecological footprint itself. We discussed in the previous class, we talked about what is the meaning of ecological footprint, then what is the origin and development of ecological footprint, and what can be the indicators to estimate the ecological footprint. And today we will be discussing what are how to calculate ecological footprint itself. So, after understanding this, now we can also calculate the ecological footprint, because we have understood what are the indicators that can be taken into account for finding the ecological footprint. So, who is preparing this ecological footprint? Because it is a tedious job and it needs the data from very minuscule level, micro level to macro level. So, first of all, we have found this ecological footprint data or the calculation in the Living Planet report that is published by Wildlife Fund for Nature. And after that, these two guys, Rees and Wackernagle, they have also founded this NGOs that is known as the Global Footprint Network, and they prepare this network, Global Footprint Network. They publish national footprint accounts since 2003. So, for every nation they are preparing, they are calculating what is the ecological footprint of that particular nation. But however, for finding this ecological footprint accounting that is prepared by Global Footprint Network, they are making some fundamental assumptions before preparing this ecological footprint data. So, what are these fundamental assumptions they are taking into account in order to prepare this ecological footprint accounting? So, the first one is, it is assumed the majority of the resources people consume and the waste they generate can be quantified and tracked. So, this one is again very useful given the macro accounting concept of GDP, because again the way we are preparing the GDP concept, it has many limitations and it is been criticized, because we are not talking about so many accountings like your natural systems natural resources accounting. So, in that way ecological footprint accounting can be helpful in strengthening the way we are preparing the GDP even. So, the assumption here we are making that in GDP we are not taking into account this resources that people are consuming, natural resources the people are consuming, as well as the externalities or waste they are generating. But however, in ecological footprint, this is assumed that this natural resources accounting can be possible and resource calculation, that is why can be possible, and the number of or the amount of waste we are producing out of economic activities, it can be quantified as well as tracked, from which source these waste are being produced. The second fundamental assumption that this ecological footprint accounting is making is that an important subset of this resource and waste flow can be measured in terms of these two concepts. The first one is biologically productivity area and the second one is in terms of ecological footprint event. So, the second thing that it is assuming that this resources and waste, it can be measured in terms of this concept, that is biological productive area, that is necessary to maintain the flow of goods and services. And the third assumption is that resources and waste flows that cannot be measured are excluded from the assessment, leading to a systematic underestimate of humanities true ecological footprint. And even we cannot say that ecological footprint is giving a kind of perfect picture, so far the accounting of resources are concerned. it has also its own limitations. So, that is what it assumes that for those resources and waste flow, it is not measurable, or the ecological footprint accounting is not in a position to measure. They are systematically excluded. That is why there is a chance that we may underestimate the humanities' true ecological footprint, but given the data scarcity, so if this can be taken into account, then obviously there is a potential that ecological footprint would be a kind of, would be giving a kind of perfect picture for accounting. And another assumption it is making, that weighting each area in proportion to its bio productivity, different types of areas can be converted into a common unit. Why we are assuming this common unit concept? Because we have taken into account these 6 subsystems, starting from your cropland to your built up land to the carbon, and the units expressed would be obviously different, they are measured in different units. So, in order to overcome this problem, this footprint network, they are using a common unit, that is the global hectares, which takes the world average bioproductivity. So, in our earlier example we talked about, we need for let us say cropland footprint, by taking into account let us say this wheat. So, what we have taken into account? We have taken into account the average world average bioproductivity or yield of that particular crop, and then we compare. So, another assumption is that because of this single global hectare, it represents the single use, and each global hectare in a way in a given year, it will be representing the same amount of bioproductivity, they can be added off. So, the global hectare, that is for the forest land, it can be added off with the global hectares with the cropland, with all other parameters that we have taken into account. So, summing up is possible across all these systems and across all the time. So, another assumption it has made is, as we know, this human demand is expressed as the ecological footprint. So, this can be directly compared with nature supply, that is biocapacity. So, here we talked about that this human demand is synonymous to ecological footprint, and that can be compared with nature supply, that is in terms of biocapacity. So, these two terms can be compared. When it can be compared? Because they are expressed in, they do have different units of measuring units, but when these two concepts, they are measured in same units, that is in global hectares, that is why they can be compared. So, how to calculate this ecological footprint? After understanding this, these are the assumptions we are taking into account for calculating the ecological footprint. Let us understand this. So, generally literature is giving us 3 different methodology or methods to calculate the ecological footprint. The first one is top down method, second one is bottoms up method, and the last one is input output models. So, what are these? So, if you take into account this top down as well as the bottom up approaches. So, for these two methods, a land consumption matrix is constructed for all the economic activities, and each entry is filled with the amount of land used. So, it is expressed in terms of the land consumption matrix, how much of land is required for all these economic activities, for performing all these economic activities. And by summing off the final sum of the entries, we are taking into account, which will be giving us the picture of the total ecological footprint. So, in the first approach, that is the top down approach, we are involving the data collected from different agencies or statistical units like your national and regional statistics. For example, we can take into account the per capita consumption data of energy or food, or likewise for preparing this ecological footprint by taking into account all these sub ecosystems or sub ecological systems. And then all this data collected, it will be filled in the matrix, because it is expressed in terms of what is the area of land that is required for these economic activities. So, in case of this second method, that is bottoms up approach, we are taking the data, but here we are taking the data that is collected by individually. And in case of top down, we are taking into account the data collected by some at a macro level, let us say for a nation, for a country, for a state likewise, and then we are filling that this is the land area required for these economic activities. Whereas, in the bottom up approach, we are taking into account this data, the same level of data, but these data are collected at individual level. So, that is why while talking about the scales, so this bottom up data will be focusing more on micro scales, like we are taking into account a particular city like Roorkee and what is their consumptions in terms of croplands. So, what is the area or what is the land required for maintaining, for sustaining the demand of all the residents of Roorkee, and likewise, or you can talk about what is the ecological footprint of a particular institutions like IIT or all the IITs, so that you can measure. So, here we need to take into account the data that is collected individually. And however, the kind of limitations or disadvantages that we are having with this kind of calculation that we are making is the system boundary, is the assumption of system boundary. So, if there is no designed or no defined system boundary, then it will be difficult to find out the ecological footprint of the concerned. And many times it is actually difficult to find out this system boundary, to define this system boundary, right. So, for example, we can take the case of the embodied emissions that are associated with car manufacturing, right. So, then in that case how to calculate this, and it will be so this is a kind of problem we will be facing if you are preparing this bottom up approach or you are following this method. So, here we simply say that this system boundary may not be able to capture the entire ecological footprint. Here, for example, this embodied emissions associated with manufacturing of car might not be reflected in ecological footprint that is calculated. So, again why? Because when you are talking about this embodied emissions in the manufacturing, so it talks about not the final car that we can use, right, and that is why you can prepare this ecological footprint, but also it needs to be taken into account the very processes and sub processes, the emissions associated with the very processes and sub processes for manufacturing a particular car, that may not be actually taken into account for preparing this ecological footprint if you are following this approach. And the last method, that is relatively new method in terms of in comparison to the bottom up and top down approaches, that is the input output method. And here in input output method, it systematically follows that what are the different inputs we are taking into account for preparing this ecological footprint, and what are the different outputs that we are finding because of this. And by taking all these methods, what we can estimate, that we can estimate this ecological footprint, and generally we are saying that it is expressed in terms of global hectares, that is why it is expressed in terms of a common unit, and it will not be difficult to compare the footprints across the systems. And from a study it has been found that the global hectares, that is GHA unit, it can be of various scales. For individual level it is having different scales, for regions it is different, for countries as well as for this planet itself it is different. So, here 1 hectare is equal to 2.47 acres. So, accordingly you can find out what is the global hectares. So, precisely you can say that this GHA is defined as the annual productivity of 1 hectare of biological productive land, or in terms of C, with world average productivity. So, here we are taking into account the productivity of 1 hectare of land or 1 hectare of sea area per annum, which needs to be expressed in terms of world average productivity. So, if you are talking about the fishery area of fish land, so we need to take into account what is the world average productivity of land, right, for this 1 hectare per annum, and accordingly we can calculate. So, as this GH is giving a very the same unit, measuring unit, then it is not difficult to find out or to sum up the footprints across these 6 sub ecosystems. So, here you can take an example on this ecological footprint and ecological reserve or deficit, or how this data can be used in order to understand the sustainability concept. So, for example, it has been estimated that in 2014, as for this EF report, the per capita global footprint was 2.8 GHA, and the global biocapacity in 2014 it was 1.7 GHA per person. So, from these two data, that is giving, one is giving the per capita global footprint, and the second one is giving the global biocapacity data. So, the first one is giving the demand side factor, and the second one is giving us the supply side factor. So, from this two data set, what we are finding or how you are interpreting. So, here you can say that the ecological footprint of humanity in this case overshot Earth's biocapacity by how many units? That is obviously 2.8, that is your demand is 2.8 for the humanity, total humanity, and the supply, that is supply in terms of this sub ecological systems or in terms of biological global biocapacity, which helps us providing the demand or fulfilling the demand, that is 1.7. So, if supply is less than demand, then obviously, so we are actually finding a scarcity or a deficit, ecological deficit we are saying, or in other words we can say that this ecological footprint it overshot the Earth's capacity by 1.1 GHA, or in terms of deficit it is minus 1.1 GHA. So, the same thing can be interpreted as that here it may also mean 1.7 Earths would be needed to sustain the current resource demand, because we are requiring 1.7 GHA per persons. So, for further clarifications we may you may follow this reference. So, this is the original web page of this NGO footprint network, which prepares the ecological footprint data since 2003. And also you can follow this calculation methodology of NFA, National Footprint Account 2010. So, it lucidly, it very simply explains that what kind of methodology we are applying for calculating this ecological footprint data for the nations and across the nations of the world. So, that is all, that is how we are completed with the 2 indicators that explains the sustainability. And now your task is to explore more that how this ecological footprint can be related to sustainable development concept as well as the other indicators of sustainability like your human development index. You can explore more. So, now you can further analyze or explain that what is the relationship between ecological footprint and sustainable development, and what kind of correlation might be there among this ecological footprint, sustainable development and other sustainable indicators like human development index. So, you can just explore more by understanding this ecological footprint as an indicator of sustainability. Thank you.